Okay, then we're ready to go. Good evening, as always. Good Vach. Now we're in the second of the lecture series. I want to thank always as we start with Shomer Amuna for allowing us. We're going to be sharing space, I understand, with a bunch of events the next couple of weeks. Shomer is a busy place. I want to thank, of course, the Lehmann family for being the series sponsor. And as you can see, it's very kind of them, actually. As you can see, tonight is being sponsored anonymously by somebody who's a fan of Dr. Shmuel Lehmann, who's one of our local psychologists. And I know who it is, but I can't tell you anything about it. But let's put it this way, it's very nice when someone does that. My lips are sealed beyond that. Again, I want to thank our tech team. Ellen is here. She just had her second knee replacement surgery. In other words, the first one didn't work, and they did it again. Okay? So that's already, and let me put it this way. As a veteran of World War I appreciate somebody who went to World War II. Okay? And therefore, I wish you were full shalema, of course. And now, without any further ado, we'll get down to business. To the name of the series, this is 2024 to 2025. The name of the series is A New Century and No Peace. State of Israel and Jewish People from 2000 to 2004. Tonight's the second lecture, which is entitled The Elections of 2000, 2001, Bush, Sharon, and Bad News for Arafat. And here we go. The year 2000, we all remember, we were younger, actually. Some of us were, some of us were. As the year of elections, both in the USA and in Israel. To be technical about it, the Israeli elections happened right after, the beginning of February 2001. But the season was already on in late 2000. So it was a year of change, as we say, political, constitutional, democratic change in both countries. Right? That's what I'm focusing on. Now in America, that election was a funny thing. You think that Bill Clinton, with his economy and his relative avoidance of wars, would have left a Reagan-esque legacy. Just as Ronald Reagan handed it over to his vice president, because I remember in '88, when George Bush ran, it was like Reagan's third term. It's not that George Bush was so, amazing. So you think that Clinton could hand it over to Al Gore. Again, they had a surplus at that time, to point out last time, right? The arguments in politics at that time was what to do with the surplus. You see? That's like, right, exactly, mind-blowing. But it didn't turn out that way, as we all know. Just as there was something about Reagan that people liked, despite his failings, there was something about Clinton that people didn't like, despite his achievements, right? When all said and done, he couldn't shake up that Slick Willie business, even though he should be able to say, I've left the country at peace, we beat Y2K, right? We did all this stuff, but nobody thinks, it's funny in history, nobody thinks today Clinton was such a great president, even though you might find some historian will say, well, let's look at the numbers and all that. This had to do with Bill Clinton's personality. Let's put it this way. Did people think that he and Hillary were a devoted couple? Right? I mean, it is what it is. Now, to be perfectly fair, they weathered the crisis, I guess we'd say today, right? And they stayed married, for whatever reason. Whatever reason. Roosevelt and Eleanor did the same thing, okay? And, you could argue, they tried to make it work, but it's something. The very fact how he got out of the impeachment, all the rest of it, gave the idea that, like that. It's interesting how personality plays a role in presidential elections. Of course, we know nothing about this in this country, okay? Separate from that, there was already in 2000 a large portion of the electorate that was socially conservative, not fiscally conservative, but socially conservative, and the Clinton administration was quite liberal, especially in gender issues. The country was divided on this and still is. So in other words, what we call today the culture fights, okay? More than, the news and others try to say it's economics, and there's some truth to that. But Lee Beymerly, that really most of the country, some people voted against their economic interests, let's put it that way, okay? Or you could argue that. And they know and they don't care. So that means they prioritize, culture issues and things like that over other issues. And if people say, oh, you're voting for the wrong thing and you should embrace this measure and you should change regarding this issue or that issue, all the rest, they don't see it that way. Not if the other side can put up somebody who can make the case. Let's put it that way, okay? And so you already started to see that if you have an intelligent Republican candidate, you can sort of like, operate on those fault lines within a potentially Democratic electorate. When Roosevelt ran in the New Deal and all that, they didn't have any of this stuff. It was economics, you see. It wasn't a social thing. But now it's a social thing as well, at least in my lifetime and in yours. The problem for the conservatives at that time, after Reagan, was the Republican Party fielded weak candidates in 1992 and 1996. In other words, if you want to be objective about it, Clinton did not run against strong opposition. I mean, when Dole ran in 96, it was over the day it started. We all know that. And when Bush ran, he was already pretty unpopular, okay? I just remember, I'm going by memory here, much anything else. Bush did everything right in that war, the Schwarzkopf War. He did everything wrong in everything else. It's funny, you understand? And when they asked him during the campaign, why should you vote for me? I'm the best candidate, talk like that. And so it's not like Clinton had a strong opposition. So that's who Bush and Dole, Dole, my goodness, he was over the hill already, at that time. And sometimes you get this in parties. It's an interesting phenomenon in American presidential history. Somebody says, it's my turn. You see? It's my turn. I've been there like Yoshua ben Nun. I arranged the tables. I fixed the heating system. And it doesn't go like that, right? To a certain degree, it was like that with Kamala Harris. He said, I'm the vice president. I get the thing, I get to do it. Now, after the election, the Democrats said, oh, we should have someone else, and so on and so forth. But here's on the other foot. It was the Republicans had the problem. And, of course, the Republicans in the 1990 elections, in the 92 and 96, had what we would call the Pat Buchanan problem, okay? In which you saw the right wing of a certain sort in that party, what they call the paleo-conservatives as opposed to neoconservatives, seemed pretty nativist and anti-Semitic to one degree or another. I don't know if it's true or not. I think it is true, but the point is they had that smell, and that hurt the Republicans in those races, and they knew it. In other words, Buchanan did not win the nomination in any of those two, but he had made enough of a noise, you understand? Now, in 2000, George Bush Sr. appeared out of nowhere. Who heard of this guy? Do you remember that? Like, he's Bush's son. Like, who is that? Right? And he usually had been thought of a lightweight and non-serious candidate, okay? But as we know, history demonstrated that George Bush Jr., directed by Karl Rove, proved a very disciplined and professional politician. So maybe he didn't have all these brains, but he was smart enough to say, you guys are the handlers and tell me what to, and stick to it. You understand? And I remember they used to call it message discipline. He kept saying the same thing over and over again, and apparently that's important in a candidate. I never was a candidate. So he proved to be a very disciplined professional politician, as Bill Clinton had been. Clinton was like a natural, you understand? Though you can't compare Bill Clinton and George Bush in terms of the IQ. I think everybody knows that. But the Democrats, as we know, nominated Al Gore, who seemed a nicer version of Bill Clinton, if you remember. I remember particularly Gore's wife was always trying to get all the pornography off the records, make it more child-friendly. How can you be against that, right? And who seemed, it seemed to voters, at least as I recall, there was going to be something of a third Clinton administration. You understand? And that, of course, is Al Gore, as we know. A very decent person, all the rest of it. Now, what's no good to us tonight is we all know that he picked Lieberman. So when doing that, Al Gore made a giant declaration. I don't care if the guy's Jewish. I don't even care if the guy's Shomer Shabbos. We all remember, do you remember, did I say this last week? Lieberman had a stock speech he used to give all the time, at least to Jewish audiences. And when he was a senator, when he was a senator, and Gore was a senator and also vice president, there were times, Lieberman would say, that he had to vote. So he didn't want to walk on Shabbos, so he stayed nearby. I think he stayed at Gore's apartment. And Al Gore knew all the ropes, and they're good friends. So he turned the lights on for him, turned the lights off for him, all that stuff, right? And Lieberman would conclude by saying like this: I'm not necessarily the greatest and most powerful Jew in history, but I've had the greatest and most powerful Shabbos guy that ever existed, right? Vice President of the United States. And, you know, in those days you could say that. You see, in those days you could say that, and you wouldn't get all this, you know, visceral anti-stuff. And so that's a moment in history. I feel it was an episode. I fear it was an episode. It came and went. Here's an acceptance speech.
Is America a great country or what? Yes, it is. God bless America, land that we love. Dear friends, 10 days ago, with courage and with friendship, Al Gore asked me to be his running mate. And I don't have to tell you that this has been a most extraordinary week for my family and me. There's an old saying that behind every successful man, there's a surprised mother-in-law. Well, I can tell you that this week, that's been particularly true. I want to thank the daughter of my mother-in-law, the woman who just introduced me. Isn't she great? Hadassah, even before Al Gore made me his running mate, you made me the luckiest guy in the world. I am so fortunate to have you by my side on this journey, and I thank you, sweetheart, for everything you mean to me. That miraculous journey begins here and now.
Right? You can find it yourself if you want the rest of it. But I want to tell you something. Could you imagine that at the Democratic Convention this year? You see? In 100 ways. Well, I couldn't. Aside from being interrupted by Palestine and all the rest of it, it's a different America. And you see, he was cheered. So I'm just saying, 24 years ago is not only 24 years ago, it was a long time ago. A lot has changed. Let's put it that way. I'm not happy with the change, but a lot has changed. Interestingly, Al Gore had been the point man in the Clinton administration's efforts to combat terrorism. And if we remember, the year Clinton entered the White House was the original attack on the Twin Towers. It just didn't work. They put these bombs in the bottom, Khalil Sheikh Mohammed. And that awakened the Clinton administration, not the American people, to the fact that you got people running around and want to blow up things. And the Clinton administration, people didn't watch it so closely unless you were a news junkie, you know. Had all these task forces and things like this. They were worried about this occasion and that occasion. They were worried about Y2K, but there were also a whole bunch of different public, they blow up Congress and things of this nature. And the Clinton administration, they had to learn, not successfully, but they had to learn, you have to coordinate the CIA, the FBI, you know, the NSA and all these sorts of things in ways that were contrary to the laws that have been passed in this country in the 70s especially, after the Watergate and the church hearings, to take away the ability of the federal government to coordinate its efforts so that, if the FBI knows my personal information, the CIA has no wishes to have that, for example. Or if the NSA knows this about me, then the others don't have the right. This was in law. They changed this in the Patriot Act after the 9/11 and 2001. And therefore, it was very difficult to coordinate everything successfully. They knew that there's a guy named Osama bin Laden running around trying to blow up America. The Clinton administration, Al Gore. And I guess if you read the news, the news reports, it's just another Arab name. It only became famous after the 9/11. So it's funny that in regard to the issue of terrorism, which is important to the whole country, especially the Jews, I'm talking about Middle Eastern terrorism in the United States. So Gore was actually kind of, shall we say, uniquely qualified, to get on this. The Bush administration did not know this. When they came in, you lost that institutional memory, and they put in a whole bunch of new people. And if you said to George W. Bush, Osama bin Laden or something like that, it's like, it doesn't have any special meaning. It came to have special meaning, but it didn't at the beginning. And anyway, we'll come back to that. All of us recall the close election of 2000 and the Florida Chads and all that stuff, which of course reflected a nation divided over social issues. Now, it was roughly 50-50, whatever it was. Social conservatives responded to liberal disdain and contempt, and still do, by creating a conservative subculture of their own, which featured hatred of liberals and blaming them for all that was wrong with America. So this is when Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and the others emerged and had gigantic followings and still do. So there's a reason, okay? Now, interestingly, George Bush Jr., who was a disciplined and opportunistic politician, was not really socially conservative. But he knew he had to shed his father's image of being soft on liberalism. And at the same time, he wanted to get as many votes as possible from both sides. So if you remember, his slogan was compassionate conservatism. In other words, he tried to have it both ways. Okay? It kind of worked. But Bush was elected and subsequently reelected with an increased majority in 2004 as a reaction against the woke. That's what I think. Same way Trump was elected on that basis. People just don't like this. Now, the country's divided. Half the people say, how can you be against this? And there's something wrong with you and all the rest of it. And half the people say, I don't like it. And we haven't solved that yet. As things turned out, George Bush Jr. in 8 years in office never really pushed, for example, an amendment against gay marriage. I remember they were talking about Defense of Marriage Act or something like that, and they want to make a constitutional amendment. The marriage is one man and one woman. I'll say it again, a constitutional amendment. He never pushed that, okay? The conservatives, were like angry at him. And that's why later on the Supreme Court could say that gay marriage is constitutionally protected. It wasn't legislated, it was constitutionally protected. He wasn't really a hardline conservative, a reactionary. He wanted to reverse the clock. And believe me, he's disliked among your right-wing Republicans, Adayom Azet, for this. But he was more of a conservative in the 19th century point, which is, okay, we made the changes we made, no more, right? Let's conserve. Let's stay where it is and no more. That's a different way. Now, did this strategy work in the year 2000? From a professional point of view, yes. In other words, Bush did win, although barely, the Electoral College, though not the popular vote. Isn't that interesting? He did not win the popular vote. Most people voted against Gore and, for the other guy. Bush got 271, he got 266. That's very close. It's not like the current election, right? It's very close. That's why a little bit here and a little bit there would have changed everything, right? And look at the numbers. Gore got 500,000 more votes. They both got around the same, but he got more than half. That's 51 million, and just 50 and a half. So another about 500,000 more votes in the large electorate that we're talking about. So it was a close business. That's what I want to say. That's why I keep saying the country was divided in all kind of ways, pretty much, down the middle. Now, look, it's an interesting election map. Now that you and I have been used to election maps from the Trump-Harris election this past week. So you see that, what do you call it? The Republicans, the Democrats, by the way, carried more than Harris. They got Pennsylvania, in addition to the usual states. They got Pennsylvania, they got Illinois, she did too. They got Wisconsin and Michigan. You see? Right? Yeah, in Iowa, right. Iowa's not much. But Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are a lot. And of course, they got the West Coast. It's just an interesting map. You understand? It's just an interesting map. Now, because we've become much more aware of these things thanks to the optics and graphics that they provide you with, and now presidential election is a little bit like a sports game. You know? But they make it that way. And of course, you had the famous fact that the case had to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, didn't it? Where you had Scalia writing the opinion, I remember. Now, let's put it this way. Who's Scalia going to favor? You know, the Republicans or the Democrats? Okay? Now, Scalia was a great man, and he never did anything without consulting with me, as you see over here. Well, that's me, right? Right? And one of my trips, we went to, truth is, he's very kind to take off the time to speak to a group like ours, in the United Supreme Court, and he had us for 2.5 hours. Okay? Steve was there, right? Yeah, I remember. But let's put it this way. I won't share with you what I told him to do. You know, you have to figure out yourself. Now, what was the effect of Bush's election? I mean, vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East, because that's what we're interested in. What was the effect of Bush's election on the Israel-Arafat dispute? That's where it gets interesting. Many of us in 2000 did not vote. Michael's not here tonight. Yeah, Michael, yeah. I'll tell you where I'm going. Many of us didn't vote for Bush because we thought he's going to pursue his father's policies, which were perceived, rightly or wrongly, as unfriendly to Israel. In other words, many Jews thought it's going to be James Baker again. Okay? And James Baker was seen as not being friendly to Israel. Now, Baker denies this, of course, and in his book, let's go to the next one, he does make again, there's what you feel when you're there and what you feel and what you look at the record. And to be perfectly balanced about it, the Bush and Baker administration did a lot of good things for Israel, but they had strong disagreements on the West Bank and the settlements. But many Jews didn't trust him. Now, I remember discussing this with Michael Glazer, who always follows the politics closer than I do. And I still remember this. And he told me in an email, he says, no, Bush Jr. is different. It's not going to be Baker. It's going to be a different set and all the rest of that. I did not believe him. But he turned out he was right and I was wrong. Because Bush Jr. did not have the team of Bush Sr., which is just interesting, for better or worse. In the foreign policy area, Bush Jr. picked the neocons. His administration was the hour of the neoconservatives. Okay? So all of a sudden we saw people in these highest positions, publicly and behind the scenes, like Cheney and Colin Powell and Rumsfeld, and behind them you saw a bunch of Jews who were, like from Commentary Magazine, the neocons, Scooter Libby, if you remember him, Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams. I mean, this guy was his Deputy Secretary of Defense, this guy was Deputy Secretary of State, this guy was in charge of policy planning and all. I mean, they had powerful positions in the government. So we're dealing now with administration, certainly in the first Bush administration, which was really dominated by the neocons. Notice, basically, George Bush said like this: I'm not a foreign policy expert or anything like that. You guys are, so you run the show. You advise me. Now, neoconservatism is very interesting. Neoconservatism is what we call people who formerly were Democrats, and, you know, from the Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy type, and became disillusioned with democratic policies because of the left-wing turn as they perceived in the Democratic Party, and black anti-Semitism as they saw it, and anti-Israel feeling, and the fact that they saw America's moving away from what they perceive as a meritocracy to affirmative action and that sort of thing. They used to make these arguments in Commentary Magazine. And I'm talking about educated people, famous writers, professors, intellectuals, and they really formed like a certain clique. They particularly were opposed to being soft on Russia, if you remember. They saw the Democrats like Jimmy Carter administration and other Democrats in the 80s as being soft on communism, soft on Russia. I'll say it again, they themselves were formerly part of the Democratic Party, and a lot of them were associated with Scoop Jackson. But Scoop Jackson was rejected as the Democratic presidential candidate, and they saw it as a betrayal. So in other words, they're moving in the wrong direction. That's who they were. Ronald Reagan actually picked them all up, and they played an important role in the two Reagan administrations. And then George Bush Sr. didn't like them and kind of replaced them with his guys. And now you're back in the year 2000. You see how everything follows in cycles? Now these guys came back. So in other words, they're very articulate. They wrote 1 million articles. And basically, Bush hired the commentary magazine. All right? I mean, it sounds funny, but, there were some neocons that were Democrats, like Moynihan, but the majority of them took the road I just described, okay? And I want to say that they were very, what's the right word? They're very worried about the future of Israel. They're very concerned for the safety of Israel. That's a big, motivation to them. Now, they wouldn't say that, or they would say it in terms of, it's not because I'm Jewish, right? But it's because it's better for American national security, better for democracy, better for the West, and so on and so forth. I get it. But they really were, let me put it this way. If you read what they wrote, like when Jimmy Carter, for example, was president, oh my God, they're going to sell Israel down the drain. If you read what they wrote when Kissinger was Secretary of State, he's selling Israel down the drain. We don't really look at it that way now, unless many of us still have the memories of the old days. But this is who the group was. How should I put it? They really, let's put it this way. When Russia finally collapsed, the neocons said, we did it, because we bucked up Reagan and the others, not to yield to all the Russian stuff. If our opponents would be in power, they would have bailed Russia out and things like this. And I'm not saying it's true, that's what they said. And therefore, they viewed the fall of Russia as a triumph of Reaganism and therefore neoconservatism. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying that's what the feeling was, okay? Now, they definitely had a take on Iraq. And if you're talking about Cheney, who had been Secretary of Defense in the Schwarzkopf War, and you're talking about Rumsfeld, and Colin Powell had been Commander-in-Chief of the Army during the Rumsfeld War, these guys. So the feeling was we didn't finish the job in 1991, okay? That was a mistake that we made, and it has to be rectified. Now, really, Bush wanted to get him because he tried to kill his father. Told you last week. In 1993, Saddam Hussein stupidly tried to blow up George Bush Sr. Like in a Greek tragedy, never imagining in 1993, in 1,000,000 years, that Bush's son, who didn't exist, would come back. See, like Rav Hutner used to say, at the end of the day, the Ron Shalom runs the world. You can't make a movie out of this, right? Although I'm sure they did. And now, Cheney, who's Vice President of the United States, and let me put it this way, was the most powerful Vice President of the United States. We remember this. He wasn't a regular Vice President. Basically, Bush had no trouble with Cheney running a lot of the administration, especially in foreign policy. So he was determined to destroy Saddam, and he was in a uniquely powerful position to do so. So he said, I don't want to go down in history as somebody who beat him in 91 and let him get away. There's nothing worse than that. It's like one of these cowboy shows where you catch the bad guy and then you let him go, and then he goes on and kills people. See, you got to finish them off when you had a chance. And let's put it this way, Saddam Hussein was no tzaddik, okay? And had they not gotten rid of him, I understand, we'll talk about all that, and not gotten rid of him, he'd be running around today causing as much trouble as he could. So you do have that aspect to it. But this is very important for what's coming in the next 4 years, as you and I know. And this is going to very heavily affect the United States' position vis-a-vis Israel. on general issues, on national security issues, and on the Arafat issue. Let me put it this way. The guy, if you remember, in 81, Menachem Begin bombed the reactor in Iraq. And at that time, the Reagan administration strongly criticized him because you didn't have the right to do it and all the rest of it. And at that time, even the Reagan himself didn't really want to do it, but they did it. And at that time, there was an arms embargo for a while on Israel, right? Bill Sachs, of course, flew the main plane that bombed the reactor. He'll tell you about it.
I didn't break it.
What?
I didn't break it.
Right, okay. He didn't give away the secret. Anyway, the commander of the Air Force down was David Ivry, okay? The commander of the Air Force at that time in 81. Later, he was the ambassador in Washington. Cheney, when he became president, basically wrote a letter of apology to David Ivry. And he said, it's a good thing what you did to Saddam Hussein. You see? So I'm just trying to show you what a sea shift it is in official administration thinking when it comes to these issues when you have the neocons in charge. And in general, the neocon take on the Arab-Israeli conflict was very interesting because they argued, kind of in a Wilsonian way, Woodrow Wilson way, that the safety of Israel is an important goal of a U.S. foreign policy. Because as a democracy, Israel can cause the spread of democracy to the Arab world. I don't think anybody would say that today, but 25 years ago, these arguments were made. There's no democracy in the Arab world, just before the Arab Spring. You have a functioning democracy in Israel, and it does work now, and the Arabs can see that, and the Israelis are now having a startup nation, and they have won their wars, and so forth. Maybe we in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and all the other places should imitate them and have a democratic policy. It's a Woodrow Wilson kind of approach, right? In which you view the spread of democracy as an end in itself, the argument being that democracies usually don't start wars. Interesting, right? Democracies usually don't start wars. I mean, the United States will start a war in George Bush Jr. time, right? But it's very unusual. The United States got in World War II because we were bombed in Pearl Harbor. They got in the Korean War because the Koreans invaded South Korea, you see? They got in the Vietnam War thinking that they're saving South Vietnam, They didn't simply say, let's go and have a colonial war and fight somebody. Back in Teddy Roosevelt's time, maybe you did that, but usually not. And so the argument was, if only the Arab countries would get a real democracy, it'd be different. Today, we have a more sophisticated, more cynical view. You understand? And you just hope that you can survive in that part of the world. You don't have any, close hopes that tomorrow they're going to get a George Washington and a Thomas Jefferson over there. Which I say experience has, hardened people's attitudes towards it. But it wasn't at that time. And the argument goes like this. Hey, we just won the Cold War. How'd that happen? Wasn't that a triumph of ideas? Hadn't the values of the West triumphed over Soviet tyranny? That was the argument. Remember, Ronald Reagan knocked this wall down and things like that. There is some truth to that, but Russia is one thing and the Middle East is another, you see? But they said, why not? Why can't it happen in the Arab world? Why can't it happen in all the Muslim world? If it doesn't happen, the Muslim world, they argued, will one day destroy the Western world and replace it with a dystopian fundamentalist nightmare. They're taking over Europe. They're going to outbreed them, as they say. They'll turn the countries away from being democratic countries into something else. It'll just be terrible. These arguments were written in the 80s and 90s in the commentaries and these other kind of magazines. Okay? Thus, the cause of spreading democracy, with Israel playing an important role, was the only way to end Middle Eastern terrorism. Today, people would laugh at that argument, but that's what they said. And it's the only way to prevent Europe from going under, because we have to make all these people of the Middle East and those immigrants who have immigrated to Europe think democratically and Westernly. That's how it goes. The only way to assimilate the vast throngs of third world immigrants who are being allowed into Western countries at that time, and still are. Number one, for doctrinary liberalism. How can you be against immigrants? And number two, because they needed workers to pay for the old age benefits of the Western societies, right? If you have countries in which you have shrinking population, which isn't it interesting, China, of all places, has a shrinking population. I find that hard to get my head around. But many, many countries have shrinking populations. So on the one hand, when I was young, I thought they said that's great, right? Didn't they used to say too many people? But now, yeah, it was EPG. But now, the problem is that, so if your population is getting older, so the factories are losing workers as they age, and there's nobody to replace them because they don't make children. So nobody's going to work in the factories. Who's going to pay for my old age benefit? Who's going to pay for my Social Security and my Medicare? That's how that goes. You got to get somebody to do the jobs. What about the people you bring in will undermine your country and transform it into something else? All I care right now is my Social Security benefits. Don't take that away from me. This is how it went. So it's a whole world of thinking. That's what I'm trying to get you across. It's a whole philosophy, shall we say, all right? Now, in the neocon point of view, Yasser Arafat was an unregenerate and sought to destroy Israel under the guise of peace and through plausible deniability. In other words, they did not trust the Oslo agreements. And as Arafat's subsequent behavior seemed to confirm. So, Arafat says, I condemn all the terrorism, even though he didn't. And anyway, it's all Israel's fault. So they blew up a discotheque, and they killed children, and this, that, and the other, but it's Israel's fault. The conviction, so what I'm trying to say is like this. In Clinton's time, they knew everything I just said about Arafat, but they said he's the guy we have to deal with, and we have to make this work despite all of his foibles. The new guys come in, like I say, Cheney and Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and all the other guys. He's like, Arafat is the mother of all evil, and he's out to destroy Israel any way he can, and he'll use any opportunity he can, and therefore, something has to be done about him. And most importantly, they had the conviction that Arafat was lying and was murderous, and this would become a basic feature of Bush and Cheney and the whole neocon team, as we shall see. Just to give away the story, Clinton had Arafat over many times. Bush never had him once. In fact, I have a friend of mine, I won't say who was at some kind of a donor thing in 2001, 2002, and here in Baltimore. And a donor thing for Bush. And when Bush was leaving, he passed by me. He said something like, I want to thank you for supporting Israel, some words like that. This is what he told me. Bush went to him like this. Like this. He says, I'm not talking to Arafat, and things like that, which shows you it's a new day in the White House. So the election of Bush and Cheney, which is initially welcomed by the Palestinians and the other Arabs, because they thought that Clinton was too pro-Israel, right, would prove disappointing to them. Now how the Arab-Israeli conflict would intersect with the Bush-Saddam conflict, which ought to be something different. No, that the problem with Iraq is one thing, and the problem with Arafat is another thing, but they'll intersect. That would become one of the most interesting aspects of the first Bush administration. Among other things, the neocons observed that Iraq was the sole strategic Arab threat to Israel now that Egypt and Jordan were out of the picture. In other words, we're looking at the year 2000 or 2001. Here's the Middle East, of course. Egypt is not a threat because they have a treaty with Israel. Jordan is not a threat because they have a treaty with Israel. Syria would like to Syria. Syria is too weak. We didn't even know at that time that Syria is involved in a huge civil war. Okay? But they're too weak. And I think the old man said Assad died in 2000, actually, I believe. So there was a new guy on the throne. That's not a threat to Israel. Saudi Arabia was not a threat to Israel, okay? Because they were already, worried about their jihadists taking them over. And so who's the military threat to Israel? And the answer is Iraq, which had a big army, or at least that's what they thought. And they say that they're a threat to Israel. And so, I guess looking in retrospect, Saddam didn't do a very smart thing. He didn't know who the new administration is by constantly reiterating, we're going to destroy Israel one day and all the rest of it. Because these guys in the White House took him very seriously, and said, we got to take him out, you see. So that way of thinking was not in the Clinton administration. So I'm trying to point out that not only was it change in administration, change in thinking. Cheney and his guys were precisely the ones who regarded the failure to topple Saddam in 1991 as a major strategic error. His father hadn't done it right. He wants to fix it. Schwarzkopf's army could have done it. And with little imagination and skill, they said, they could have turned Iraq into a pro-Western nation, which would have been a game changer. It's not true. We found that out. I'm talking what they thought. Okay? This would become actually a fixation of the first Bush administration. And now, and it removed, by the way, it would remove the strategic threat to Israel. At the time I'm talking about, which is 2001, Iran was too far away. They're all the way over there. They didn't have these ballistic missiles and stuff like that. And all I can tell you is, people didn't think of Iran as like a strategic threat to Israel. Maybe tomorrow it will be, and it sure is today. I'm talking about that time. They said Iraq is the problem. Finally, there was the curious fact that George W. Bush ended up enjoying a positive personal chemistry with Ariel Sharon. All right? That surprised everybody. We'll talk about that. Here's Sharon giving him a photo of Bush with a yarmulke davening at the Kotel. Okay? And because when Bush was a governor or something like that, he visited Israel, and Sharon, who was not the prime minister, took him around in a helicopter. And knows he played it smart, and he befriended him. Where I can tell you right now, Ariel Sharon was not welcome in the first Bush administration. He was the butcher of Beirut and all that stuff. But George Bush, W. Bush, the second Bush, had a completely different, very good personal chemistry relationship. And that matters a lot. What can I tell you? And Sharon was the prime minister all during the first Bush administration. We all know the chemistry between an Israeli prime minister on the one hand and president of the United States is very important. Bibi has had 4 presidents, actually 5, and he did not have good chemistry with Clinton. That's why Clinton knocked him out. Clinton knocked him out by sending Carville over to run the campaign for Barack against Clinton. He sure did not have good personal chemistry with Obama. Do you remember he came to Congress and spoke against him? Okay. He sure does not have good personal chemistry with Biden. Right? Biden's a tzaddik, so he helps Israel anyway. It's not because he has good chemistry, with him. He sure did not have good personal chemistry with Kamala Harris, which is, she turned her back on him, and that's one of the reasons people voted against her. The only one he had positive chemistry was the next president of the United States, right? This is when, let me put it this way. I remember, if anybody went on the trip with me, sometimes before my knees were bad, I used to do a lot of trips on Cholamoid and that sort of thing. It's fun. And for a number of years, I was trying to get into the White House, to a White House tour. And this was during the Obama administration, where he just laid down a fiat because he was arguing with Congress, no tours of the White House. It was frustrating. I tried to do it this way. It didn't work. Because remember, he was fighting with the Republican Congress over the budget. And he thought if you close the White House, you'll complain to your congressman and support Obama's budget. And then Trump got elected, and then he opened the White House. And we were actually the day he opened. So this was Cholamoid Pesach. Was that March, April of 2000 and whatever it was, 2017. And Karen will remember this. And when you come in, where they let the tourists in, you come in that door. So they always have pictures of the new administration with foreign leaders. It was all Bibi. And I don't know if anybody was there to remember this. There's like half a dozen pictures or more with Netanyahu. Okay? Said he got along. Later they didn't. You know? But now he's trying to repatch it. This is when Trump signed the act recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, which is extraordinary by international law. And so all I can tell you is it does matter what the personal chemistry is. It does matter. Now, the Bush-Sharon chemistry would have all kinds of results, as we shall see. Some anti-Arafat, I told you before, he just cut him off. The United States had communications with Ramallah, but they didn't ever bring Arafat to the United States. If you remember, or we'll see, Israel has kind of, what's the right word, blockaded him. And it led eventually, this chemistry, to Sharon later in the second administration unilaterally pulling out of the Gaza Strip, what you call the hit not quit, the disengagement, if you remember that, which of course is very controversial. That's because in these conversations with Bush and the Bush team, he came to feel this is the right thing to do. And I'll say this much. Sharon has plus and minuses, but, you know, let's put it this way. You hit me over the head once, I learned a lesson. And I think he saw from the way he acted in the 80s and the Reagan administration, Bush administration, it's necessary for Israel to coordinate everything closely with the White House. That's just the way it goes. You understand? Which Israel right now is not doing. It's necessary to coordinate everything. Now, that means you pay a price. You understand? So it's a tricky business. And I shouldn't pronounce judgment because I'm not in the driver's seat. But it's a tricky business because if I don't want to coordinate everything with you, there are a lot of things I think I need to do that you won't say okay. And then it becomes a question, you know, what do I do? But I know that Sharon, who we shall see, will conduct a very vigorous anti-terrorist sort of thing. I mean, whatever he's doing, he's coordinating with Bush and the Bush team. So it's interesting. In the short run, as I said before, Arafat, who had been a frequent and welcome guest in the Clinton White House, because they signed the Oslo Treaty in '93, was it? And he was there a bunch of times afterwards because they were all negotiating back and forth. But he was shut out of the Bush White House and never allowed in. So the election of Bush Jr. was consequential. It was not a James Baker redux. That's just interesting. Now I want to turn to the Israeli election, which actually took place February 6, 2001, right after the American election. American election, of course, in 2000, November 2000, and Israel, beginning of February, the following February. Okay? Now, at that time, in 2000, Ehud Barak, who had been elected in May 1999, keep this in mind, it's a short term. He was elected in May 1999, he's going to be knocked out in February of 2001. So that's not even 2 years. Okay? He had tried to nail down a final peace with the Palestinians, even at the price of great concessions. Okay? I mean, let me remind you that Barak offered all of Israel, all the West Bank, 96%. And as Clinton said last week, and he could get another 4% from wherever he wants of Israel, he offered them the Har HaBayis. Okay? Israel, I don't know how that was going to work out, but Israel can keep the Kotel, at least one side of the Kotel. Not the other, well, seriously, not the other side. That would be the mosque. And that would be Palestinian territory. And they're going to, what I'm trying to say is like this, maximalist concessions. Okay? And if Syria had been willing to play ball, he would have, again, maximalist concessions. He would have given a total retreat to the 67 borders. There were even discussions about some kind of Syrian access to the Kinneret. That's very unclear. So let me put it this way. Barak Tynan, as they say, it's worth it if we get real peace and legitimacy. That's a position. Okay? That was his position. And let's just pretend for a minute. Let's pretend for a minute that you could. because you can't. But let's say you could. It's an interesting question. Would you be willing to give up the Harabayas for a real peace? It's an interesting question. You understand? Especially if you have children in the army. You understand? If it were really possible, you know. But of course, he got neither, right? Because as we know, they had the Camp David meeting in the middle of 2000 in July, and with Clinton and Barack and Arafat. He thought he could do another Jimmy Carter, but Arafat was not Sadat. You see? Moreover, Hamas and company were never party to any deal, and they intensified the suicide bombings in Tel Aviv and everywhere and elsewhere. In other words, Hamas, who didn't rule the Gaza Strip at that time, it was all officially under Arafat. So Hamas was underground in the territory by Arafat. But Arafat didn't mess with them. It's like having a bad gang in your neighborhood, and basically the cops kind of don't want to have any interaction with them. You see? They were horrified by the possibility that Arafat might actually make peace, even with the Harbais. Because Hamas, as you know, is opposed to any Israel. Okay? And Arafat, who I think in my opinion and yours probably also was opposed to anything, but pretended. You see? So he's saying that there could be a peace with Israel, at least theoretically. And so if it looks like, this is the dynamic in the Middle East. If it looks like there might be a peace treaty, make a whole bunch of extra suicide bombings, which will radicalize the Israelis and kill any possibility that anybody be interested in signing a peace treaty. And it works, right? One of the reasons they say, like I mentioned last week, that Sinwar launched the attack on October 7th was to scuttle any peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I don't know, but that is how they operate. And by the way, it was very successful. You see? It's successful. And so, here you are, Ehud Barak, trying your best in close coordination with the White House. Right? So much so that Clinton, after the failure of the Camp David meeting, said the fault is all Arafat's. Right? Israel made a full offer, and it's their fault. So you can't get more of a haskama, as they say, from America. But nevertheless, what do you do about the fact that they're blowing up buses, they're blowing up schools? You can't be in a bus stop. All the Israelis knew how to do, and all they still know how to do, is assassinate the bad guys. But that didn't stop the bombings. Haba Batur. You kill this guy and no one takes the place. Now, I'm not saying it's not a good idea to assassinate the top people. What else can you do? But it doesn't, unless, it's sort of like a cancer. Unless you kill each and every one, it's going to go on. And so here you are, Ehud Barak, saying, I'm trying to do, the usual thing, and it's not working. Because, I don't know if you remember, well, give me a moment. Israel, in other words, faced and did not solve the problem of asymmetrical warfare, and they haven't solved it today. Right? I know we're fighting in Gaza, I know we're fighting in the Hezbollah, I get that. How do you solve it? You see? Short of killing each and every member of Hezbollah, short of killing each and every member of Hamas, which they can't. So how do you solve the problem of asymmetrical warfare? George Washington showed all you have to do is just stay alive. Eventually, you'll win. You see, Washington didn't win many battles, but British could never get rid of him, right? And when he went to Battle of Yorktown, they said, the heck with it. You see? Now, England could do this because across the ocean. Israel's living right there. That's something the Arabs don't appreciate. Barak's political position as prime minister wilted as he desperately tried to get Arafat to rein in the suicide bombings. Barak figured it was in Arafat's interest to help Barak remain prime minister, which wasn't true. In other words, logically, you want me to be the prime minister because otherwise you get the Likud. What's better for you, them or me? Yeah, but Arafat wants to kill Israel. He doesn't think like that. You know the old story, they say, how's it go? certain animals crossing the river, and a scorpion gets on top of it. Yeah, right. And anyway, the scorpion kills him in the middle. I said, "You're going to drown too." He says, "It's the Middle East." This is an example of that. Okay. So Arafat did not help Barak. Au contraire, he didn't really make any effort to get rid of the Hamas people, and therefore the bombings continued and the stabbings. You see, from the point of view of Arafat and company, the Israeli state was intrinsically fragile. The more dangerous life was, the more the Jews will give up and leave. That's been their fundamental philosophy from day one, that Israel really represents something artificial, colonialist, if you like the term, and colonialists get up and leave. The French did in Algeria, in Indochina, the British did in a lot of places, and so the Jews will. The French didn't go back to England. Where are the Jews going to go? They go back to Poland, go back to Germany. So there's really the racist kind of approach. But you see students chanting this right now in American universities: go back to Poland, go back to Germany, go back to wherever you want to go. You see? So all of a sudden it's not racist to make those things anymore. I mean, if you remember, we're talking about the Second Intifada, 25 years ago. Maybe you had kids in school there. Maybe some of you were in school there. People were afraid to take the bus. People were afraid to go to Machne Yehuda on Fridays. Schools needed extra guards. Crowded bus stops were scary. Used to say, don't hang around crowded bus stops. The Shuk, the old city, the Arab quarter, forget about it. You went to the Kotel, you totally skirted any Arab thing whatsoever, because every few days somebody got stabbed at the Yafa, at Shar Yafo. I'm talking about 2004, right? To make matters worse, remember, to the Arabs, Israel's another Algeria. They don't see it in different terms. They don't want to see it in different terms. And when you did this in Algeria, they left. Remember, to the terrorists, it's a colonialist thing. To make matters worse, in October 2000, so the Camp David was in July. And then after that, things start simmering up. In October 2000, a series of violent riots broke out among Israeli Arabs, not in the Shtachim, okay, who were citizens of Israel. I don't think many of us remember this. I'm talking about cities like Nazareth, and the Jews did bad and the Arabs did bad. Look. On the 9th of October, not that long ago, hundreds of Jews rioted in Nazareth, breaking windows in a shopping mall and torching cars. Jews. The mayor of Carmel, that's in Israel, was attacked when he tried to calm Jewish citizens there. Arab property, Bat Yam, was vandalized. A large police force was required to thwart hundreds of demonstrators on Tikva and Bat Yam from attacking Yafo. In a fool of 700 Jewish demonstrators blocked Route 65, assaulted policemen. 100 broke off and tried to enter Arab village where the police warned them. In Akko, hundreds of Jewish riders vandalized Jewish Arab shops and cars owned by Arabs because you're blowing us up all the time. You're killing buses and things like this. This is not an answer. This is what happens. The newspaper Ittihad reported that four men stabbed an Arab worker on his way to work in Rosh Ayin. In Yafa, a mosque was torched. Police looked on. Attempts were made to burn Jewish apartments and Jewish synagogues by Arabs. In Ramla, a shul was torched and traffic was stoned and firebombed. In Lud, a Jewish citizen was shot. A school was burned down. Right? Attempts were made to torch a police station. In Nazareth, crowds of mourners from the funerals of two demonstrators killed a day earlier went to the police station and threw rocks and firebombs at it. Despite the police decision to keep all officers inside and out of sight until quiet set in, the police responded with tear gas. When the stone throwing continued, the mayor and two members of Knesset guaranteed a cessation exchange for a police retreat, which they did. Arab youths vandalized traffic at the Canyon Junction. They're losing control. And I'm talking about in Israel itself, not in the occupied territories. We forget this because so much has happened since then. And as they say in Hebrew, tzaras achronis meshachas as rishonis. The new stuff make you forget the old stuff. But at that time, this was the old stuff. Like I say, I don't know who everybody is, but maybe some people had children or grandchildren, whatever, in seminary, yeshiva back in that time. They used to say, don't go out, and stay inside, and, don't go away for Shabbos unless it's closely supervised by the school and things like that, because there were stabbings everywhere. Right? There were stabbings everywhere. And I mean, the Israeli Jews said that's all we need. The irony was that this was all happening under Israel's most liberal prime minister. Barak was Israel's most liberal prime minister. The prime minister who, for reason of national security, he had been the commander-in-chief of the army with a general, all right? He said this is necessary to get a political solution to end the wars in Israel. But of course, what do these events do to the public in terms of this kind of thinking? It's no good. And in addition to this, the Shtachim, the occupied territories, were seething after the failure of Camp David. After all, if there's not going to be a negotiated two-state solution, what's going to be? The militants said, another intifada will shake Israel and will cause a unilateral pullout from the West Bank. That's what the Arabs said. This was not crazy. It did work in 2006, getting Israel to withdraw from Gaza, despite the pain of dismantling settlements and getting nothing in return for it. What did Israel get from withdrawing from Gaza in terms of political concession from the Arabs? Nothing, right? So the situation in 2000 was explosive just as America was going through the presidential election. After all, this is all happening in October, November of 2000, during the presidential election. In other words, Clinton at that time was oozing power and influence because that's what happens when you're a lame duck president. In internal Israeli politics, the right was excoriating the left because you're damaging national security through your so-called peace policy. This is what you call peace? Okay? The right argued that Arafat wanted not a two-state solution and a final peace, but the destruction of Israel through insurrection and asymmetrical warfare. All through the West Bank, Arabs were arming and practicing with guns. They were swaggering and the Jews were cowering. I remember emails about this at that time, right? You know, here's the Jewish settlement over there. They're all target practicing, the Arabs, because they're getting ready for something. This atmosphere that I'm describing led to the political resurrection of Ariel Sharon as leader of the right. Bibi was seen as a blunderer. Okay, so he's not the guy. But Sharon was the right guy, they thought. Sharon had hurt himself politically in the 80s with the Lebanon War, no question about it. So if you're someone who was a parent of a kid that was killed in the Lebanon War and all that, I mean, you're not going to vote for Sharon. But now it was 18 years later, and Sharon had worked assiduously with the political pros to rebuild his image based on his Ferris wheel philosophy. He said, politics like a Ferris wheel. You got to be there, here, in order eventually to get up there. You know, it's a cycle, okay? And he was right, okay? Look, Trump, right? He was right. It goes like this, okay? And now, in the middle of the rumbling Arab street, with the volcano gurgling, Sharon makes a famous public visit at Har Bayis with heavy security. Take a look at this.
ראש הליכוד אריאל שרון וחברי כנסת מן הליכוד סיירו הבוקר בהר הבית. ביקורם חולל שם מהומה, על המקום הגיעו מאות פלסטינים כדי למנוע את הביקור. בהתנגשויות נפצעו 20 שוטרים מיידוי אבנים ו8 פלסטינים נפגעו מירי כדורי גומי.
אני עולה עם שרון, אני מקבל אותו בשער המוגרבים. הוא הגיע עם 13 חברי כנסת. אנחנו ידענו שחברי כנסת הערבים ממתינים לו על ההר, שזה גם דבר שמייצר איזשהם אנרגיות. בהר ידענו שעל ההר יהיו אלפי אנשים.
So in other words, he's doing a public act. And public act goes like this. You Arabs want to say that the Har Bayis is a no-go zone. There's a lot of that in many places, including in Europe and the United States. It's a no-go zone. You don't go in this neighborhood. So I don't care what Israel says. You don't come up here. I got as much to come up here as you do. Believe me, he wasn't religious. So what's he going to Har Bayis? He said, I'm Jewish, this is as Jewish as this is Arab. Maybe more so. And I got the right to say it. Now, it came in with a heavy security, all the rest of it. But this is in the middle of Intifada. And so what he's basically saying like this, you spitting on me, I spit on you. Now, that's a polarizing move. Some will like it, some will dislike it. But as a politician, you figure more will like it than will dislike it. Okay? Now, this specific act is what triggered the second Intifada. The machlokes between the Mossad and the CIA was that the Palestinians claimed the violence is a result of the provocation by Sharon. but I said it wrong. But the Mossad and the CIA said, we have information. Arafat was planning this already. He was just looking for the right moment, because it doesn't start overnight. There was already planned. They're looking for the right moment, and he used the Sharon visit as an excuse. The result was the eruption of the Second Intifada, with stabbings everywhere. I don't know if you remember. They specialize in stabbing, okay? Jews have guns, they have knives. I mean, stabbing bad. The left claimed Sharon was inexcusably provocative, okay? The right said, oh, really? So the Har Bayit is a no-go zone now, is that right? You conceded it. Now, to be perfectly honest, to the Israeli left, they don't want another Beit HaMikdash. so let it be a no-go zone. You understand? Is it worth lives? That's a completely different hashkafa than somebody says, this is the Beit HaMikdash. You see what I'm saying? It's really, it's a little bit, I'll be rabbinical for a second. It's a little bit like Abraham and Lot, this week's Parsha. Once, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. That's Israel. You go to the left, I go to the right. You go to the right, I go to the left. And so, are we really going to allow this phenomenon? The Arabs did the same thing in the 1930s Intifada under the British, the Grand Mufti. They made the Har Bayit area a no-go zone. Jews couldn't go to the Kotel and risk getting killed. And it worked until the British cracked down, and they sent in the army, and then they had to fight a fight. This is in 1938. They had to fight a military fight, to recapture the Temple Mount. Under General Montgomery, by the way. So he tried to reprise this in the year 2000. Barak, who feels the support falling away from him, calls for elections. You see? This is the end of 2000. Listen closely to what I'm about to say, and I'll develop this more next time. This is a unique election. It wasn't what you think like today, when you have Israeli elections, you have parliamentary elections. And then we see who wins, and then they form new coalitions. He did not call for parliamentary elections. He called for personal prime minister elections. Because Israel at that time still had that stupid law. You got to watch out for poli-sci professors, because they sound good in class, they don't know what they're talking about. These left-wing professors dreamed of something which came to bite them. And that is that the right-wing, especially religious parties, have too much influence in the coalitions. Therefore, you have to divorce the position of prime minister from the coalition stuff, and somebody should run separately for prime minister the way you run for president in the United States, and a one man versus one man, or one person versus one person. And so Barak said, I need a vote of confidence that I can be the prime minister, so we're going to have a prime minister election. The Knesset will remain the same. You see? The parties that are there remain the same. By the way, at that time, Shas had 17. Just the Shas party. So it remained the same. But of course, as we know, it's going to boomerang. And the reason I say boomerang is not because Barak will lose the election and Sharon will become the prime minister, but because it actually gave the religious parties more power. Because if you have a personal election, for me versus you, then it's the whole public. Then I have to campaign to get physically large number of votes over you. And the religious population, not the majority population, but it's a big chunk. And so both sides have to kiss up to them. And so you kind of defeated the whole purpose in the first place, which is try to make the prime minister independent of what they call schita, of religious pressure. Didn't work out that way. I mean, Sharon, as we'll see, went to Mei Sharm. But anyway, the hour is late, so let's finish this next time. With that, I'll call it a good night.